In my opinion, the 2013 Great Gatsby movie is a bad adaptation. Now, I wouldn't say it's a movie I hate, but I specifically remember the time when I first finished reading the book without having any prior knowledge of the story, and I came out of that experience absolutely loving it, having a clear picture in my mind of the novel's aesthetic and tone. I then remembered that a film existed of it with DiCaprio and Tobey Maguire, and I thought, wow, this is gonna be great, an adaptation of my favorite book with two of my favorite actors. And then I watched the movie and I was just confused. This is not the book at all. Did Baz Luhrmann, the director, even read the book? Did I miss something when I read it? I'm sure this is a common experience with a lot of adaptations, but why? I think before we dive into my issues with the Great Gatsby film directly, we should first figure out why is it so hard to adapt a book into a movie, and what do you need to create a successful adaptation? Oftentimes, fans want adaptations to be a beat-for-beat, like-for-like remake of the source material. They've fallen in love with the source material so much that they don't want a single thing changed, removed, or added. This belief most recently cropped up in my circle of the internet when HBO announced that they're planning to redo Harry Potter as a TV show. Amongst all the anger and disgust at HBO for doing this way too soon, I heard repeatedly people say, well, at least with the longer runtime of a TV show, they'll be able to include more from the books. But is more necessarily better? If you looked at the Harry Potter movies, you can make a strong argument that the film with the most book content would be Chamber of Secrets. I mean, famously, it's the second shortest book turned into the longest movie, seemingly because the filmmakers didn't want to leave anything out. Unfortunately though, I think this was a bad decision. The film feels convoluted and weirdly paced. The middle just kind of meanders around the mystery it's trying to build rather than moving with momentum and purpose. And the reason for why that is quite simple. Books and films are different mediums and therefore require different styles of storytelling. Books have to build up worlds, and in them you get to live and hang out with the characters. You get to read what the characters are thinking in each given moment, and the author has the power to stop, slow down, or speed up time as much as they want with the way they write. Movies, on the other hand, are visual. They're quite often like paintings and photography, in the sense that the imagery, achieved through composition, color, costumes, whatever, tells a lot of the story. There's obviously still a script, but because films are ideally consumed in one sitting, stories are expected to be kinetic, every scene leading into the next and every moment has a purpose. Obviously, on top of all of that, the actors are expected to do the words on the page justice, while with books the readers get to imagine the story in a way that's perfect to them. Put simply, when making an adaptation, you can't just directly copy the source material, you have to play to the strengths of whatever medium you're moving the story to. And in my opinion, one of the best examples of a book adapted into a film, conveniently, is Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. But what does this movie get right if getting the plot right doesn't necessarily matter? Two words: tone and themes. In terms of tone, the book keeps the playful whimsy of the first two, but often goes a lot darker, with moments like the Dementor attack on the train, for example. In that scene, the book slows down time to really give a detailed description of the look of the Dementor, as well as how Harry feels losing his soul. These writing decisions establish the dark tone, as well as link into the book's theme of fear. The film, on the other hand, establishes the tone and theme through the dark blue color grading, the suspenseful music, the sound of the Dementor, and very cinematic images like the window freezing at Ron's hand or Lupin suddenly waking up. Both these moments didn't exist in the book, but these changes aren't a disservice to the story because they only punch up the tone and the themes. Successful film adaptations have a good understanding of their source material's tone and themes, and then they morph the story to fit to the strengths of movies. Now that we've established the two main things that a good adaptation needs to keep consistent, we can go back to The Great Gatsby and discuss whether it does those justice. Starting with the tone. What is the tone of The Great Gatsby novel? Well, it's obviously up to interpretation, but I would say the overwhelming emotion is melancholy, especially when it comes to Gatsby and the theme of romance. Everything is just quietly sad, because characters are too in their own world to understand how broken they are, and the narrator, Nick, is too apathetic to console anyone, or really face these emotions. You see this melancholic mood in quotes like, "No amount of fire or freshness can challenge what a man will store up in his ghostly heart." The second most prominent mood of the story, I would say, is cynicism or scornfulness. This is primarily because Nick grows to hate the other characters and the Roaring Twenties life so much that every description just has this undertone of hatred and frustration. You can see this in little things, like how Nick describes Gatsby's ambitions to be rich as grotesque and fantastic conceits, or how he sees Gatsby's life as full of ineffable gaudiness. The most on-the-nose moment of this is at the end of the book when Nick says that Tom and Daisy smashed up things and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together. Obviously, in the story, there's a lot of different tones and moods going on. There's a couple angry moments, there's a couple funny moments, there's a couple cute moments. One sentence can change the vibe of a whole chapter. But I think if we're thinking big picture, a Great Gatsby movie must be melancholic, and it must be critical of the 1920s elite, or else the filmmakers are fundamentally missing the point of the novel, and they may as well just make a whole different story. Now, does the movie get this right? What is the tone of the 2013 Great Gatsby movie? If I had to describe the tone of the 2013 Great Gatsby movie in 2 words, I would say it's electrifying and dreamlike. Dreamlike counts as 1 word. Something I do respect about this movie is how roaring and exhilarating and luxurious they make these parties. Whether it's accurate to the time period or not, it conveys Gatsby's life way better to modern audiences than the boring period piece dinners you see in other adaptations. However, there needed to be a bit more condemnation with the way these parties are presented. Because at the end of the day, the book is a critique of how shallow these sorts of lifestyles are. But ironically, me as the viewer of this movie, I wish I was there partying to Jay-Z with Tobey Maguire. There are a few moments in this film where they attempted to show the negative sides of these parties, but it's so few and far between that these sections feel carelessly tacked on, and they're often delivered in weird, abstract Tobey Maguire narration rather than just showing, not telling. A movie which I think nails the ideas I'm getting at is Babylon. Every party scene in that is very exciting, but there's so much repulsive debauchery going on that I think the majority of audiences watch it thinking to themselves, yeah, these people are weird, they're not my crowd, which is exactly what Nick is meant to feel in The Great Gatsby. But Babylon manages to convey that feeling without telling it to your face. Now, I'm not saying a good Great Gatsby adaptation needs quite as many moments of urine as Babylon. I don't think a Gatsby film needs Babylon's R rating, but you get what I'm trying to say. In terms of the film being dreamlike, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I do think that the novel has quite an otherworldly heightened reality to it, like how Gatsby's garden for whatever reason appears to be blue, or how Gatsby's first kiss with Daisy is described as an incarnation. But I feel like Baz Luhrmann's overuse of CGI and overuse of solid primary colors makes the film look too much like a fairy tale, which I think works against what the story is about. Firstly, the book is very pessimistic and mature and sad, which comes in direct contrast to the hopeful wonder you expect from a film that looks like this. And secondly, a fairy tale aesthetic prepares the viewer for a story where Prince Charming saves the beautiful princess from the evil tyrant, when The Great Gatsby is actually a very unromantic and unconventional story about an obsessive, ignorant man doing all the wrong things to get what he wants, and ultimately failing because reality can never be like his dream. Honestly, now that I'm looking at it, it's almost comedic how backwards this movie has everything. It kind of feels like this film is an alternate reality version of the story, where it's Gatsby writing it instead of Nick. Because of course Gatsby would find these parties awesome, and find his creepy quest for Daisy dreamy and romantic. We actually see a lot more of this if we start talking about the themes. The Great Gatsby, despite its short length, is one of the most dense and layered novels ever, so it's impossible to talk about every single theme here, but the most all-encompassing one is the theme of the American dream. Gatsby's whole journey over the course of the novel is one big allegory for Fitzgerald's view of the American dream. Gatsby abandons his family and where he came from to become single-mindedly focused on gaining wealth because he believes it will lead him to happiness, which in this case is personified to be Daisy. Gatsby eventually gets within reach of his wishes, but it all falls apart. He's built up what success would be like so much in his mind that nothing could ever live up to his imagination, and he can't just move on because his whole life was dedicated to this one goal. He ends up becoming shallow, death is something of a relief for him, and the only winners of the story are those who are already wealthy, because they get to live with all these luxuries without any of the work or the disappointment. Fitzgerald in the novel paints Gatsby, as well as anyone who believes in the American dream, as naive, and to a certain extent, greedy. To be honest, it's sort of impossible for the film not to present any of these messages, since they're so embedded into the story that you'd have to completely change everything to remove Fitzgerald's view of the American dream. However, I do think Baz Luhrmann's interpretation of it is quite curious, because seemingly, whether on purpose or not, this movie ends up a lot more sympathetic to Gatsby than the novel. I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with siding with Gatsby. I feel like I'm more sympathetic towards him than the average literature critic, but the ways they altered the story to make you like him more hurt the themes the story is trying to tell. It often changes the tone of scenes, and at the end of the day, the story just loses a bit of nuance and complexity. The most prominent example of pro-Gatsby changes made is the fact that they removed one of the most iconic quotes from the book. For context, pretty much every time Daisy talks, Nick describes how beautiful her voice is. He describes it slightly differently every time because he can't quite place what makes it sound so good. Nick then brings this up to Gatsby's 75% into the story, and then Gatsby's response, to me at least, feels like a gut punch. Because instead of walking asking around the question the way Nick does, he just suddenly says, "Her voice is full of money." This quote can be seen in a variety of ways, but I think the most prominent view is that Gatsby accidentally let his guard down here and reveals why he's actually been chasing Daisy. He first approached Daisy as a young man because he was envious of and in love with her luxurious lifestyle. He lied about his wealth to sleep with her, and then when she went away, it became his life's mission to have a taste of that lifestyle and love again. So he frauded his way to becoming a millionaire to win her back. This love they have may have been genuine, but its foundations are based on greed, lies, and false perceptions of each other. So like all tragedies, it's doomed to fail. Removing this quote removes all of this depth, and I kind of understand why they chose to remove it. It's one of those motifs that works significantly better in a book than on film. In the book, you have all this build-up of every time Daisy speaks, the narration says it's the most beautiful thing in the world, but in film you actually get to hear her voice, and it's up to the audience to decide whether they think it's beautiful or not. As a screenwriter, you could choose to include tons of lines of people saying, "Wow, Daisy, your voice is so beautiful," but I still think the impact there would be lost because it would feel very forced. I don't want to see this quote go because I'm a fan of the book, but if the film manages to show these themes and ideas elsewhere in the story, then it's fine. But this movie seems to remove every single moment that happens to paint Gatsby in a bad light. Like how he wants to settle down with Daisy, but every time Daisy's daughter appears in a scene, Gatsby acts like a lost child because he lacks all the skills that are needed of a competent parent. Or how in every flashback, Nick's narration is extremely judgmental of Gatsby because he sees the whole persona he has as something that a 17-year-old boy would be likely to invent. And to double down on this view that Gatsby is immature, he says, "And to this conception, he was faithful to the end." The biggest narrative misstep of the whole film, in my opinion, is the depiction of the final chapter. In the book, there's basically 5 straight pages of Nick calling up every single person on Gatsby's contact list, desperately hoping that they'll show up to Gatsby's funeral, but all of them say no. Gatsby had no actual friends. All those huge parties were just a facade to lure Daisy since they made him look cool and popular. All those guests leached off him, and he was so single-mindedly focused on his American dream that he didn't build any worthwhile relationships. The only person that shows up to Gatsby's funeral is his father, which is definitely not what Gatsby would have wanted, because the last time the book refers to his parents, Nick says Gatsby's imagination had never really accepted them as his parents at all. And this father character is just as melancholic as everybody else because he's all like, "Oh, I'm so proud of my son for getting this house. I'm so glad he got a good job and didn't get all his wealth from fraud. I know he abandoned us, but it was clearly all worth it in the end." And right at that moment, when Gatsby's story seems the saddest, Gatsby's father gives Nick a to-do list he found in Gatsby's teenage bedroom. And the last thing on that list is, "I need to be better to my parents," which is a final glimmer of hope in the story, which makes you go, huh, maybe we didn't get the full picture here. Maybe Gatsby isn't as bad as he seems. How beautiful and sad and nuanced that is. I wonder how they did this in the movie.
I rang, I wrote, I implored, but not a single one of the sparkling hundreds that enjoyed his hospitality attended the funeral.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, the film does show the rest of the final chapter in a montage sort of thing, but everything I just talked about is reduced to one line. We don't see Nick calling people, we don't see the to-do list, and we don't even see Gatsby's father. That one line reduces all of that depth to just, wow. All these people really wronged Gatsby, which again is kind of the opposite of what the story is saying. This is an example of filmmakers making a change to the source material that hurts the entire story. I have one final critique which I think brings everything together. That critique is, what is this film doing with Nick? Even though Gatsby is the guy in the title, Nick is the main character. He's not just a narrator. Admittedly, Nick is very inactive in the actual story. In most scenes, he's just observing or being pushed around. But still, Nick is all over the book because every single description or viewpoint shown is Nick's opinion. And Nick is a very unreliable narrator. He's extremely biased and quietly hateful of everyone, and he says so many conflicting details that it's entirely possible whole chapters of this book are complete lies. The story is just as much of a biased mess as if Gatsby would have wrote it, or Tom would have wrote it. But in the film, Nick is just sat there in every scene doing nothing, except randomly coming in with a bit of narration that we didn't really need. I think the film should have leaned into the fact that this is all Nick's perspective, and it should invite the audience into scrutinizing everything he says. One audience member may come out of the story agreeing with Nick about Gatsby's greedy goals, and one audience member may think, Nick, give this guy a break. And suddenly, Baz, you now have people out there sympathizing with Gatsby because they read into your story rather than you having to force feed them your opinion on the book. The part of the novel that reveals the most about Nick's character is his relationship with Jordan, because we see him constantly bragging about his honesty and at the same time hinting at the fact that he's cheating on her. He turns really apathetic about the relationship after for like a month, but still continues to say, wow, we're such a better couple than the other couples in the story. And despite this apathy, when they break up, he still says, angry and half in love with her and tremendously sorry I turned away. What a toss-up. Now, I completely understand why this subplot was removed because it's so disconnected from the rest of the story. However, I feel like without it, both Nick and Jordan's purpose just becomes exposition delivery and reaction shots to what more interesting characters are doing. So either include it or find a different way to show off their complexity and characterization, which they try to do with those therapy scenes, but I'm not a fan. The story's momentum really grinds to a halt every time one of those appears. I could probably sit here and talk about this film for like a whole nother hour, but I think you guys get the idea. This movie is just an inaccurate adaptation. But why did it come out like this? Well, that answer can pretty easily be found in any behind the scenes clip of Baz Luhrmann discussing his decisions in the movie. Whenever he's asked about why he removed something, his answer is always something like, well, I had to make the audience care about the love triangle more, or I didn't want to include that because it paints Daisy in a bad light, or if I would have left that in, then it would have taken the focus away from the love story. All of his reasoning is logical on paper, but when put into context, it really seems like Baz didn't get the book, or he got the book but just didn't really care about what it was saying, or he felt like he had to morph the hateful misery of the story into more of a conventional romance drama to appeal to general audiences. I don't know. What I do know is that this film is definitely not the book, but is that necessarily a bad thing? I mean, there must be a way to adapt a story without following the tones or themes of its source material, right? Well, that's most commonly seen with films that are based on or inspired by a book, not adaptations of a book. In these situations, the filmmaker just takes elements of the novel and then creates their own story with it. But the 2013 Great Gatsby is definitely not that. The other situation where deviation from the source material is common is with things like Shakespeare, where it's been reimagined so many times that you may as well just have fun with it and try something different, because there's already been hundreds of attempts by people to be 100% faithful. You could argue that the Great Gatsby falls into this category because there's been 5 adaptations of it already, and since it's a classic novel, it will probably have a new rendition every 20-30 years or so. In that respect, you have to respect this movie because its look and vibe is one of a kind. And while I do think some of it is a bit ugly, some of the editing is a bit jarring, and it's definitely not accurate, it's without a doubt the work of a visionary, risk-taking filmmaker. And when you see 5+ adaptations of the same story, eventually you're gonna want to see something different, and you need a guy like that for it. I feel like that belief is a bit of a get out of jail free card for Baz though, because while the visuals are interesting, most of the changes made here feel like they come more so from ignorance rather than genius experimentation. And also there still hasn't been a genuinely good Great Gatsby movie yet, so I want to see something faithful before we start getting crazy. And yeah, that's all I have to say. That's the end of the video. I feel bad for barely talking about Tom, George, or Myrtle, but I think me not talking about them should be seen as a compliment, because I don't know what to say. I have no real issues with them. I think their half of the movie is actually quite well written, and all of those actors give good performances. To be honest, I think every actor is good in this movie. However, nobody's in the same league as 1970s Tom. He is the GOAT of the GGCU, Great Gatsby Cinematic Universe. Thanks for watching.
Get the hell out of here!